So here's the question that we wanted to dig into. Who is more authoritarian, the woke or the anti-woke? And I
Mhm.
was going to give you my position. Chris will give you hers. You guys can lay out yours. But first, I'll just give you my definition of wokeness so you know like what I'm working off of here. I think there's one definition which has like a positive connotation, then there's another which has a negative connotation. The positive one was like, if you're woke, you're alert to injustice and trying to change it. The negative definition, I would say, is authoritarian in service of perceived social justice ends. And so typically when I use woke, I am typically using it more as a pejorative. I mean, people who are authoritarian in service of what they think are social justice ends. So with that definition, I would claim today, my thesis is this. I think both sides are authoritarian. Many on both sides can be authoritarian, although you can be woke or anti-woke and not be authoritarian. But I'm more concerned about the anti-woke authoritarians because, from my perspective, it manifests in legislation much more often, which directly impacts people. Whereas on the other side, I think that wokeness can be very authoritarian, but it usually manifests more through culture, which is bad, but I just don't think the stakes are as high. So I know that Sitch, for example, I know you like to focus more on the culture and not as much on the legislation, which might explain some of the disconnect here. But tell me your thoughts on this. Since I mentioned Sitch, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on who's more authoritarian and why?
Mhm. Well, first I'll say, I like your definition of woke. The one that I use is generally that woke is the idea that liberalism won't solve our social problems and that something further to the left is required culturally. Um, it's funny that what you said about like how the wokeness manifests or the authoritarianness of wokeness manifests in the left culturally and if through institutions. On the right, it's kind of manifesting through the law. Because I said the same thing myself several
Oh,
times.
cool.
And I agree with that framing. However, to be a stick in the mud, I have to question what is the point of framing the question as like who's more authoritarian in the first place?
So, I mean, I guess in my mind, the reason I asked the question that way is because of that distinction that I think the
Mhm.
anti woke people are enforcing it through law. So I think by its very nature, I would consider that more authoritarian because to me, the bar towards authoritarian is, are you legally imposing this on people?
Well, and if I can chime in here, I mean, just in terms of my own personal journey with regards to my view on wokeness, I feel like there's been an arc where there has been huge overreach and more authoritarianism on the side of the quote unquote woke that has, led to a backlash that has led to even more authoritarian tactics from the anti woke. And, people can hold whatever views they want to hold, good, bad, indifferent. And it's fine to have a spectrum of views that are out there, whether I agree with them or not. When it becomes a problem that we should care about as a democratic society, in my opinion, is when it goes from a view I'm advocating for something I'm going to use authoritarian tactics to achieve. So I think that's why the focus on, all right, who's leveraging more authoritarianism in service of their ideology at this point, that's why the question to me is relevant.
Mhm. Well, I agree with what you said completely, Crystal, about how the wokeness of the left is what's created the anti-woke right-wing backlash, especially the legal backlash that we're seeing in all these state legislatures. And I would just be cautious when we're kind of talking about this question because I don't think it should be used like, oh, the right wing is more authoritarian with their anti-wokeness, so like they're the bad guys. That should be what should be focused on when it should clearly, in my mind, if the left wokeness is what's creating the anti-woke authoritarian backlash in the law, both these things need to stop, essentially.
Sure, but people are responsible for their own actions. Like
Of
the fact that
course.
someone did something that pisses you off doesn't mean like you're justified in becoming an authoritarian.
Well, no, it doesn't justify it like morally, but when we're talking about like how how coalitions of power form, right?
Hmm.
And I think this is true for Trump. Not as much, like 100%, but definitely I think Trump was able to run and is definitely running now. And you see with DeSantis, though he's kind of floundering nationally, kind of trying to run on this energy that if the mainstream American, the normie, the undecided voter, if they're out there and they perceive that the left has lost its mind and is crazy, then they're just going to go to the right and they might not perceive sort of the legal authoritarianism that we're talking about.
So I want to get Adam in here in a second, but I just wanted to respond to what Crystal and Sitch said because I actually slightly disagree with you when you said the wokeness from the right, or excuse me, the wokeness from the left led to the right-wing backlash. I actually don't totally agree with that. I think that the right has sort of hyper fixated on some extremes on the left, and then they just sort of act like it's the entire left. And so then it leads to the backlash. So it's like they're perceiving it's the whole left going insane and being authoritarian and hyper focusing on social justice stuff. But really, they're just nitpicking like 5% of something and acting like it's 100% of the left. And that's what then leads to. So it could be a backlash, but I think it's sort of like delusional in a sense that it's like as big a problem as they say it is.
Well, we're also talking about cynical political actors who see something that has energy on their side and that they're going to use to build a national profile a la Ron DeSantis.
Of course.
Yeah.
That I totally agree with, yeah. All right, Adam, jump in. We haven't heard from you yet.
Well, you pitch this problem to me, and I object to a little bit of the framing of woke and anti-woke because, I do perceive woke as like the authoritarian left. I've never really perceived of the right, people on the right who are against wokeness as authoritarians, because you can have people on the right that are against authoritarianism on the left that aren't authoritarians, like they're not taking extreme positions on gay marriage or abortion or anything like that. They're reasonable people on the right that are against what's going on the left. I do think, I think part of the conflict that you will probably perceive with the legislation aspect of it is that the legislation affects people's lives more. But I think there's a perception issue here, because I think the authoritarian tactics that are on the left are in everybody's face all day long at work. And they're not necessarily thinking about the abortion laws or the push to make gay marriage illegal again, or these CRT bans. They're thinking about, I have to walk on eggshells at work and completely censor myself because I might offend somebody, or some grievance archaeologist might come along and dig up something I said on the internet 10 years ago and try to get me fired. So it's a much more tangible thing for people in their daily lives. And I think that's why a lot of times there's this big push against left-wing authoritarianism that is more present, even though you might say that it's not as important socially or legislatively.
So basically, to sum up your argument, and correct me if I'm wrong, the argument is sort of like culture, in your opinion, supersedes legislation because it seemingly affects more people because culture affects everybody, whereas legislation might affect small pockets of people. I'm not sure I agree with that for one point, but the other point of
go
ahead.
You're saying that it affects more people. It does affect more people, right?
Well, I would say when it legally affects somebody, that has a bigger impact than just socially or culturally affecting people. Because you could, feel bad about somebody going on a cancel culture crusade against you online, and that can suck. And I don't want to downplay that. But I think it's a lot worse when you talk about legislation going after people in a way where you used to be able to take an abortion pill in state X, and now you can't take an abortion pill in state X. But look, to your numbers
that's only
point,
going to matter if you need an abortion or are in a situation
that's
where
true,
you
but
might need an abortion.
That's not the only issue where I would say the anti-woke people have become authoritarian. So like I broke this down into a number of different issues. So like book bans is one thing. We could discuss that. I think there's a lot of book banning coming from the anti-woke right. LGBTQ restrictions, we can get into that if you want, where there's a lot of that coming from the right. There's even protest restrictions in a lot of red states where they're cracking down on free protests in the wake of George Floyd, where there were some riots, but they do these bills that are overreaching where it goes after protests too. You brought up restrictions when it comes to abortion. I think that's a fair thing to bring up too. I even think things like the drug war, which I think it's an authoritarian thing to lock somebody up for putting something in their body when they're not hurting anybody else. I think that also affects that, that sort of led to mass incarceration, which impacts a lot of people. So look, I take your point in the sense that culturally, almost by definition, it will affect like everybody, right? And legislatively, maybe it doesn't. I guess my point is, even though it might be smaller numerically, I think it's like quantitatively a bigger impact. You understand what I'm saying? Or qualitatively, qualitatively a bigger impact.
I think it's just a tougher sell politically, obviously. And I think that's why the right is gaining ground on these issues legislatively, because they're able to do it, behind, uh, behind the perception of the general public. And I want to say before we move forward,
Yeah.
I'm pro-choice. Like I'm not against limiting abortion. I'm pro-gay marriage. So on those issues, I am definitely on your side. But I do think that there are people on the right that are, in favor of those things as well, that are not necessarily against them. I think it's like a far right thing that they want to ban all abortion and reban gay marriage and stuff like
I
that. But
I
I'll let
think
you guys continue.
I think that's true. And I mean, the polling bears that out. But mostly what we're talking about is what's happening at the Republican elite level, where they're in positions of power to, make laws and enforce them and all the rest. And I think what you're saying assumes that there isn't an aspiration, at least on the right, to not only have sort of authoritarian legislation that is quote unquote anti-woke, but they also want the culture. I mean, it's not that they want like free and fair exchange of ideas. There is an overt effort to, no, we want to be the ones to police the language and police the culture and what people are allowed to say and what sort of dissent they're allowed to have. So I'll give you a perfect example. You probably saw this. There's a whole thing going on over at Texas A&M where first you had a university president who was forced to resign because it came out basically, they changed the deal of a New York Times, former New York Times journalist who was going to be brought into the school in this prominent position. They watered it down under political pressure. That happened. Then you have another Texas A&M professor who criticized the lieutenant governor of the state and has now been suspended and is being investigated over that critique.
Wow.
The perfect example that I really love, which I always thought sort of said it all, is Mike Lindell, my pillow guy. Not that he's like, speaks for everyone, but I just thought this was sort of emblematic. He was setting up his own social media platform, and he's like, it's a free speech platform, but to me that means no taking the Lord's name in vain, no pornography. Like it was free speech, but as I define what is acceptable. So I think there's an assumption in what you said that there isn't also the goal, and that goal is being fulfilled now, to also take control of the culture in a very similar sort of authoritarian fashion.
Well, I think the way that I see these power struggles work is that at all times, there's always extremists in every interest group and everyone on the left and the right. They're always constantly trying to pull society in their direction. But something environmentally has to occur that allows that energy to kind of reach into the mainstream and then allow the mainstream to go in that direction. So like there's always going to be, the people, the far right people who do want to bring the theocracy or, whatever it is they want to bring into America. And they're always pulling. And then I look at it like, well, what's allowing that energy to suddenly like sink its hooks into the consciousness of the mainstream American? And I think, in my opinion, the reason that the right is able to do this, I agree that this is done cynically. There's a big problem right now with the right where, economically, the right-wing populist and the right-wing neocons don't agree on a lot of issues. And so that is part of why, like, it's perfect for them. It's actually perfect for them to fixate on wokeness and social issues because that's where there's an agreement. And if we lived in like a hypothetical world where wokeness didn't exist, it didn't come about in like 2014-ish, I don't know what the Republican Party would be doing right now at all. I have no clue. But because that energy does exist, because the wokeness does exist, it seems like that's what's giving the right the ability to do all this. And that's kind of why, when we're talking about like the issue here about who's more authoritarian, and I don't know if you've been listening to, the Young Turks and Anna Kasparian have been kind of bringing this point up a lot recently, which is that it just seems like when the left defends a lot of these woke issues, it just keeps giving the right easy victories it just tease them up essentially for easy victories one after the other.
Can I say, one thing I'm curious about is whether you think we've reached peak wokeness, because I actually reject the idea that at this point, this is the anti-woke stuff is even working out that well for the right. I mean,
DeSantis was floundering, and that was his whole thing. He just changed his strategy to put woke on as his fourth biggest issue. It used to be number one. Go ahead.
He says it in like every friggin' sentence. He clearly has decided like this is the thing. And I think part of the reason that you're saying, which is that, he's trying to stitch together this coalition of people who don't like Trump with people who used to like Trump and people who are moderate and people who are hard right and whatever. And so he's like, wokeness, that's the place where maybe we can meet. It's obviously not even working out with the Republican base. There's also some signs like bunch of these corporations are firing now their chief diversity officer because they figured out that, these trainings actually actively make people more racist in the workplace and are not working out, and that the whole thing is just a damn grift. So you've got that. You also have on the electoral side, it just doesn't seem to have the juice that the Republican Party seemed to think that it was going to. I mean, 2022, there was a lot of money that was spent on like anti-trans, anti-CRT, et cetera. It obviously didn't work out for them. And then, as I was saying with the Ron DeSantis stuff. So do you think that we've kind of reached peak wokeness and we're on the other side of that?
Well, I think we definitely reached, I think the peak wokeness of like when the things were the wokest has already passed there, because
Hmm.
it does seem like not just the Republicans are pushing back. It does seem like a lot of people are just getting tired of dealing with wokeness, which, to me, that's a great thing. So yeah, we could be reaching that point already. So going forward, it might be less and less advantageous for Republicans to use these
Hmm.
issues. But
Right.
with DeSantis, I'm skeptical that him having problems nationally has anything to do with the wokeness. I think it's funny. I said this from like day one. I said, DeSantis has the charisma of wet cardboard. I just don't perceive him like being able to go on a national stage and really get energy, especially when he's going up against Trump. Which if you love or hate Trump, you have to acknowledge that he's very charismatic. He has a lot of
Hmm.
energy, behind him. And
Yeah,
I can't
absolutely.
see a world in which how DeSantis can stand up to Trump in that arena.
So let me jump in here because there's a bunch of interesting things I want to respond to. So I think there's some level of like default anti wokeness that every reasonable person sort of has, right? So to give a couple examples of this is they had polled the term Latinx to see if people are like it, don't like it, use it, don't use it, whatever. It was like under 10%. I don't remember the exact number, 9%, 6%, 3%. It was something like that.
Mhm.
Nobody's buying the Latinx stuff. So that's like a default, like when people are like, just don't change our language colossally overnight and pretend like it's some like crusade for morality, because it's not. Stop it. There's also what was the other example I wanted to give? Defund the police. Defund the police polls at like 18% or something like that. Because I think the default perspective for most Americans is like, well, of course we need police. So if you say defund the police, regardless of what point you think you might be making, it sounds like I want to abolish the police and have no police. And people just aren't on board with that. So I think there's like a default anti-wokeness. But I think the problem with DeSantis and many on the right who are on this like anti-woke crusade is that they've started overreaching colossally to the point where they are using the legislation that I talked about before, which is actually authoritarian, which mirrors the tactics of many on the woke side. So, what was the example? Ron DeSantis is currently waging a lawsuit against Bud
He's
Light
thinking of
over the
suing.
ad with Dylan Mulvaney.
Yeah.
So you have a trans person in an ad and you want to wage a lawsuit over this? Like, that strikes me as those shrieking social justice warriors online with the blue hair and the septum ring in 2012 who were telling you, don't do this, you can't do that, stop doing this. It's like Ron DeSantis
Mhm.
has become that person, but on the right. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I thought like with the whole "Don't Say Gay" bill, which was the parental rights education, part of that bill I agreed with, which was that if a school is going to transition or socially transition, I should say, a child, that they should definitely have to notify the parents. And that's wild that wouldn't be the case. And the reason they passed that in Florida was because there was a school that was doing this without notifying the parents, and the child attempted to commit suicide. And so, like, I agree. Like, what happens is like this, like they do something that seems reasonable, but then they always take it too far because then they add the element of like, well, you can't talk about gayness existing essentially until ninth grade or whatever the frame point is. So that seems to be the case in all politics. It's like, oh, you agree like with some piece of legislation, but then someone always takes it too far.
Yeah.
But just to go back a second for the peak wokeness, even though I think we have sort of gone past peak wokeness, I mean, it's still happening. It's still an issue. Like it was only a few months ago, I think that it was Uber, I believe, fired or suspended their DEI chief, not because they're like, oh, you're too woke. They fired the DEI chief, who I believe was Asian, because she was trying to push back against people being racist against white people at Uber. And this was this year, only a few months ago. So this like these issues are still cropping up. And I think to Adam's point, what he said earlier is that even if this legislation is, more quote authoritarian because it's a law as opposed to someone being fired from their job or the cultural pressure, it's
Mm.
still the left version of it still is like in everyone's face or in a lot of people's face at all times.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. You know, where I think the normal, like, well-adjusted human American is, you know, in real life, online, super online interactions, they tend to grant the people around them some grace, you know, some charity. Like, there's a ability to screw up and apologize and you move forward. And the problem I always had with wokeness was that there was no grace. That it's like anything you said, you screwed up. Like, that's it. You're done. You're in the bad circle. You're out. And as someone who's been a, you know, lifelong, like, liberal, progressive, leftist, whatever, wherever I was on my own political arc, like, that's a polar opposite of the way that I viewed the world. I always felt that people should be granted that charity, that there should be redemption. Even if you committed a heinous crime, I thought, you know, if you've paid your debt to society and you can reform yourself, I always believed in that vision of grace and charity. But now I do see the exact thing happening, you know, on the right that concerned me among my own side. And, like, I feel like the Libs of TikTok account is the perfect example of this, because you're talking about cancellation coming from the quote unquote left of, like, getting people fired and digging up their old social media, et cetera. Like, that's what that whole account is dedicated to. Finding someone who saying something that is weird or can be taken out of context to seem weird, hunting that person down, ruining their life, putting it in front of as many people as you possibly can. And it's not an accident that that account has become, like, a huge success on the right at this moment. I mean, that is literally the same cancellation tactics that were so decried when they were used by people who were, you know, on the left, now being deployed by large and at this point powerful account on the right.
Isn't the left, though, always separates cancel culture into cancel culture and accountability culture? And I have I look at cancel culture as trying to cancel people over things that are, you know, untrue, basically digging up evidence of racism, sexism, or homophobia that's kind of on the line, borderline, and, you know, you dig into the person personally and you find out, well, this person's not really a racist or a sexist at all. They're just framing this person as a racist or a sexist to cancel them, which I think is completely different than kind of the Libs of TikTok situation, where, you know, they're oftentimes looking at people who are in positions of power, like teachers and administrators, who are saying and doing things that really are clearly this person's belief system, and trying to put some accountability on that person.
I mean, I don't know how you can say that based on, like, one TikTok that, like, nope, this captures the entirety of this person and their ideology.
We've seen, like, if there's a gay pride flag hanging in a classroom, that's a scandal. Yeah. Like, should that really be a scandal? I don't care. If there's an American flag in a classroom, I'm fine with it. Why gay pride flag? I'm fine with it. It doesn't seem like a big deal to me.
Look, I'm outing myself here. I'm not a regular watcher of Libs of TikTok, okay? I don't, like, watch everything that comes across Libs of TikTok. The few that I've seen, though, and they've actually dug into the people, you find out that the person is, you know, actively indoctrinating people inside the classroom. So it's not just a, you know, innocent remark, or, you know, a teacher that used the N-word in class to say that using the N-word was wrong, and then this person is being mischaracterized as a racist. I guess this is a person who actively believes in, you know, LGBT acceptance, and they're out there promoting that in their classroom.
So, but okay, LGBT acceptance, I think, is fine to teach in a classroom, because it's like, hey, like, people are different, accept that people are different. I agree that there might be a line where it's like, this is inappropriate that you crossed over, but my whole point about the anti-woke crusade is that it has now very clearly gone way past the line. So there's this report that comes out every couple of years, this PEN America report on book bans. And the book bans have been really skyrocketing, and I think it's a direct result of this sort of moral panic coming from the right.
I hate to interrupt, but I object to the framing of this as a book ban when you're talking about a book that is available anywhere outside of the school library. Like, it's just saying that this material is a little bit too racy for a school library. So they're not banning the books by any means.
Well, so here's my point, though. A lot of the stuff are not over any line whatsoever. And I can give you examples where you'd agree with that. I mean, if you want me to give you a couple examples here, this is from The Hill in April. Quote, in an Ohio school district, officials recently intervened to prevent their children from hearing author James Tharp read his book, It's Okay to Be a Unicorn, during a school visit. Illustrated with bright colors and rainbows, the story is an imaginative jaunt about a unicorn pretending to be a horse who has to summon the courage to reveal his true identity. The book, ostensibly about accepting our true identities and not being afraid of standing out, was prohibited after a single parent complained that the book and author had a gay agenda.
Well, I haven't seen the book, obviously, so I can't comment on that. Obviously, different parents are going to have different objections to different things. I mean, that's part of the democratic process. So, Sitch, you want to chime in on that?
Well, I mean, I guess the issue, like with the book ban stuff, is, you know, I'm assuming there definitely, I'm sure, books that we would all agree shouldn't have been removed from a school. But I'm assuming there's also books that we would all agree should be removed from school. You know, everyone points to, I'm sure you've seen a million times, they always share this, like, some comic book that shows explicit scenes of, you know, children engaging in oral sex or something. That was in one of these books that was in a lot of these schools. And there's some Toni Morrison books that were removed from a lot of school curriculums that featured, you know, father raping his daughter and things of that nature, which, you know, I understand the artistic merit for some of these things, but I also understand a parent that's not necessarily wanting their child to learn about that in school.
I understand what you're saying completely, but I would just counter with, in this report, they lay out the exact numbers as to which books are being banned, what's in it that's leading for them to be banned. 44% of them are banned for violence, 38% are on mental health, and bullying and suicide and substance abuse. 30% is sexual health. 30% is death. 30% is race. 26% LGBTQ stuff. They only say it's a total of 24% is about, like, sex stuff. The other stuff is like violence, mental health, you know, things involving death or teen pregnancy or whatever. So it's really like we're trying to, like, you know, baby these kids who are coming to an age where they're going to have to start learning about not only crazy things in the world, but also, yeah, about their own bodies. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I started getting sex education in 6th grade in New York. And even that maybe felt like it was a borderline, like maybe they should have done it a little earlier. Too already starting to experience some things.
I mean, these kids are all on the internet. Like, let's be real.
Yeah,
To me,
of course.
like, you know, we have kids, right? What's in the school library, which, by the way, they're never even going to look at, is like the least of my concern with my children's upbringing. I think it speaks more, though, to what we're trying to get at, which is there is a moral panic on the right where there is a freak out about quote unquote wokeness, which encompasses a lot of things, including quote unquote transgender ideology, and has led to a lot of hysterical overreaction, which is translated into a lot of hysterical legislation, which is overtly like, and being struck down in courts as being against the First Amendment. I mean, a number of Ron DeSantis's laws have already been hit in federal court for, you know, violating people's First Amendment rights. If it was Democratic lawmakers, if it was Joe Biden doing the equivalent on the left, oh my God, would there be a freak out over the authoritarian crackdown on, you know, people's ability to say and do what they want?
Well, you're pitching the book bans as the right being authoritarian. And I just, like, you put these book bans, which, like I said, I don't even really think it's a book ban. It's a book prohibition in a public school, okay, which is more accurate. You put that up against something like trans women in sports, and it's not even on the radar. Like, it's not even close.
But wait,
so
how? I mean,
whose
the number
fault
of
is that?
people
I mean, the numbers are kind of staggering. There's 1,477 instances of books being banned in just 2022 and 2023. That's a 28% increase from the prior 6 months. And it includes, like, Holocaust books, man. There's a book, 2022, Mouse. It's a story of his father's experience in a concentration camp. They banned that.
Look, Kyle, you can get this out on a show, on a progressive talk show.
I do. Yes, I do.
And talk about it. But I'm just saying, the general public, the normie voter out there, is not thinking about this stuff.
But you know
They're
what?
thinking about other issues.
I agree. but
that
they're
are
also
much more prevalent in their
not.
lives than
They're
this
also
issue.
not
So,
thinking about
Trans
women
people.
in sports,
Trans people are not on
which
their radar.
affects like
They're like,
3
what's a
people.
trans person?
I mean, seriously though, I
well, no,
actually think.
if they
Hold
have
on.
kids in school that are competing against trans women, I guarantee you they're thinking.
Yeah,
I,
but
that's
again,
true, but there's
hold
7
on.
of them in the
There's-
whole country. Go
I
ahead.
mean, they've literally passed laws in some states where there's like 1 kid that this law is about.
All right, there we go. That was Sitch and Adam. I thought that was a fun debate. So I had done a lot of prep before the show because I thought like, okay, I took the question seriously, right? Who's more authoritarian, the woke or the anti-woke?
Yeah.
Every example I could come up for with like woke people being authoritarian is like a comedian got canceled, a conservative speaker got kicked off of a college campus.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And you know, a good point you made is like maybe you could look at some of the censorship online for social media as some, you know, woke people going too far, whatever, banning the Hunter Biden stuff around the election. I think that's probably a good example of it.
Yeah. well, it's
But
not
there was also
really
like
woke, but yeah.
they banned Antifa accounts too and stuff.
Mhm.
So I don't think that was purely like just wokeness gone too far.
Yeah.
But like every time I try to think of an example, another one I came up with was I covered a story recently. NYU, they had a anti-racism class for whites only. And I thought that was hilariously ironic. And also it was potentially a violation of civil rights law, which is hilarious.
Amazing.
Okay. So like those were the things I could come up with for anti-woke, for woke people being authoritarian. And I
Yeah.
do think the instinct is authoritarian. It's authoritarian left. It's about controlling. They're controlling because they want to bring about what they perceive as more social justice. But on the woke side, I mean, the anti-woke side, I keep mixing it up. On the anti-woke side,
Mhm.
man, the list I was able to come up with was absolutely endless. So I referenced that PEN America report on all the books being banned. It's 1,477 books in just 2022 and 2023. We're talking about Texas, the #1 state, 438 bans. Florida, #2, 357. Missouri, Utah, South Carolina. These are all conservative states. The Stop Woke Act with DeSantis, parts of it were slapped down as being unconstitutional because it violates the First Amendment. That is definitely authoritarian. I mean, I have an example in here, ABC News from February. They had pictures of Florida schools where in the classroom, they were directed to cover up their bookcases because the state needed to vet the books first to make sure the books were allowed in the classroom. I find that incredibly authoritarian. I gave you guys a list of some of the books that were totally innocuous. Books on the Holocaust, books on just like race. There was one book about like a female black basketball player who made it. That was banned.
Yeah.
There was this one woman in Florida. I forget her name. There was an article. I think it was a CNN article from about a year ago where there's this one woman in one county in Florida who was on a crusade under the Stop Woke Act, I think it was, and she got like dozens of books banned just on her own.
Yeah.
Right. And then you also have this was part of my research as well. In the wake of George Floyd, there was these Republican bills that popped up all across the country, which basically criminalized protest. Now, they did it under the guise of, hey, some of the protests turned violent. It was riots. Now, I'm anti-riot. Anybody who's reasonable doesn't want businesses being burnt down that have nothing to do with any sort of injustice
Right.
anywhere, right? But these were absolutely overreaching bills. Here, I'll give you an example. Republican legislators in Oklahoma and Iowa have passed bills granting immunity to drivers whose vehicles strike and injure protesters in public streets.
So insane.
A Republican proposal in Indiana would bar anyone convicted of unlawful assembly from holding any state employment, including elected office. A Minnesota bill would prohibit those convicted of unlawful protesting from receiving student loans, unemployment benefits, or housing assistance. I mean, that's crazy. What are we talking about here? And they have the number in here somewhere. They talk about Ron DeSantis did a similar thing.
Well, and the one I
Disorder.
loved with him was he passed some anti-protest law, and then remember when there were those like Cuban protests against the like Cuban government,
He's like, let him go. They're
and
good.
yeah, and then suddenly
good.
the law was not enforced. But
Oh, let me just give you the number.
yeah.
Okay. So Republican lawmakers in 34 states have introduced 81 anti-protest bills.
wow, that is
My guess is
wild.
virtually all of
That's
them are
wild.
unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So when I say I'm worried about anti-woke authoritarianism, this is it. Also,
Right.
the abortion stuff, like that stuff concerns me because they actually, unlike Democrats, the Republicans actually do stuff. They say we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and they do it. Right. And I don't agree with those things.
Right.
Right.
Well, there were the number. First of all, I really enjoyed that, and I think those guys are great, and I enjoyed the back and forth with them. I think they made some good points. One of the points they were making is, the laws are like not great, but those laws only affect a small number of people, whereas the culture affects everyone.
Right,
Like
yeah.
we all have to live in this culture, and everyone's going into work, and they're all afraid. I don't want to like say the wrong thing. I'm gonna get fired, whatever. But I no longer think that it's fair to say the right-wing effort is just on the legislation front. Now, they may have somewhat less cultural power, but they certainly are doing their darndest to impact the culture as well and have their own culture of cancellation too. And I think the Texas A&M thing is a perfect example. I think libs of TikTok going out and finding like whoever to cancel, et cetera. I think, all the various freakouts about the movies that come, oh my God, Little Mermaid is black. We can't, we gotta boycott, whatever. These are all attempts to use this like authoritarian tactics with regards to the culture too. So I don't think that piece is fair. And then the other thing that was interesting to me, confusing to me, is there seemed to be an argument that was being made by Adam, I think in particular, that, well, the left went crazy first. And so it's kind of understandable that the right went crazy. And
I don't think he'd say understandable. I would just think he'd say it's one thing led to the next.
Well,
like that led to that.
But it was offered as almost like a justification. Like, well, the real culprits here are the left because they caused this reaction, as if the people on the right who are doing the reaction aren't fully responsible for their own activities. And also,
but also, you go back far enough,
well,
like the
that's
civil rights movement. It's like, okay,
so
white racism was a backlash to the civil rights movement.
Exactly. You could say the wokeness was a reaction, and I think that this is a reasonable interpretation, was a reaction to the like insanely racist and unhinged treatment of Barack Obama. And there's you can just keep going back of, well, this,
so you just
they
caused
us
Everybody
to do
has
this
agency.
and then they caused us to do this. Like,
everybody has agency. We got to treat it like
that. Everybody's responsible for their own insanity, regardless of somebody did something you didn't like and you felt a certain way about it. Like, you still are responsible for your own actions. So the fact he brought that up a number of times of like, yeah, but the left did it first. And so I think it gives an opening for the right, and you can understand where the right is coming. He didn't say it exactly like that. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that part I was like a little confused by.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the point he's trying to make, that in the cultural zeitgeist, in a certain Gamergate era during the internet, you had these overreaching lefties who, they would be outraged that there was a video game with a woman with big tits, right? And like, he's saying, well, this, like, the fact that there are some psycho people on the right who went too far as a result of that, he's saying there's a causal connection there. But I think your point is a very solid point, that you could just keep that chain going further back and further back and further back and further back, and you could always find something that led to something else.
Yeah.
And it's like, at some point, rational, reasonable people sort of rise above it and say, I think this is BS and I think that is BS. And it's like, that's the whole point of being an enlightened centrist, right? It's like, from their perspective, this is how they view it. It's like, we're going to try to find the truth and sort of get through all the partisan BS. And yeah, I mean, I thought it was a very fun debate. I think it's an interesting topic. I think the biggest disconnect comes from the fact that they are more interested in culture, and I am more interested in policy. And so that's why their focus is, and I wanted to bring something up to them at the end, but I totally forgot to do it. And I had it jotted down on my notes here. But, and I don't know, maybe they could, if they watch this, maybe they could do a reaction to it on their own channel. But I was going to say, like, I like their content. I watch their content. I definitely think they're honest when they say that they're centrist. But I wanted to bring up to them this concept that I came up with, which is there are your nominal politics and your effective politics. And you can nominally be a centrist. Yes, my label is a centrist. Yes, if you ask me my positions, I'll run through them, and they fit into the centrist box.
They
and I
see
think
themselves as center-left, too, don't they?
Well, Adam said that. I think the general interpretation for most people is that Sitch is center-left and Adam's a little more true center, or maybe center-right even. Basically, Sitch is a little to the left of Adam is the general perception. But if you ask them, they might both say, no, I'm center-left, right? But the point I was going to make to them is, okay, those are your nominal politics. If you check off the boxes, that is where you fall. But the impact of your content, because they focus a lot on wokeness, does that, I don't want to say mislead the audience, but does it leave the impression with the audience that if all you're doing is beating up on woke people all day and woke people are associated with the left, are you attracting more of just a right-wing audience? That, you're telling them what they want to hear, even if your intention is not to sort of feed into that, does it kind of feed into that?
Yeah.
And we've seen this, and that's not to say they're doing anything wrong. It's their show. They do whatever the hell they want to do. They could talk whoever they want to talk on whatever issues they're interested in. That's a fact, right? But I'm just curious if they're aware of that dynamic, because I had to grapple with that same thing when it came to my own audience, where I fed too much into the doomerism and the nihilism on the left and the dead-end approach to try to get like a third party or something in order to win an election, which is not possible unless you totally change the laws and the structure of the country, get rid of first-past-the-post voting, do ranked choice voting, a stupid conversation until we get to that point, right? I had to grapple with that I was attracting a particular kind of person who's incredibly nihilist, incredibly doomerist, thinks it's virtuous to do nothing and just throw stones from the sidelines at anybody who's trying to make any positive change.
Yeah.
And so it's like, doesn't matter that I'm nominally like, I mean well, I'm a lefty, I'm trying to get these policies implemented. If my actions in the world are creating people who are doomer and nihilist and have checked out of the system, I'm not doing something that's a net benefit. I'm actually creating more of a problem. And so you have to grapple with that as a creator, is like, who am I attracting? Why am I attracting these people? And what messages are they taking away from it?
Right.
I think we all, as content creators, need to be careful to, if you truly are, hey, I'm a centrist in this way, okay, your content should reflect that in a way where it's more likely people who are of that variety and that flavor are in your audience and they take the message from it that you want them to take from it, not some inadvertent thing which is not in the direction you want.
Right, because you can't assume that they're seeing, the insanity on the other side somewhere else.
Exactly.
You have to sort of assume, if this was the only content that they were consuming, what would be their view of the world?
Exactly. And so
Right.
Here's how I'm guilty of it. There was a very long period where I only went after Democrats, and I was doing it from the left. But I thought my perspective was like, well, of course the Republicans are too far gone. Of course I disagree even more with the Republicans. Of course I think they're crazier. But I didn't talk about it that much. It was only going after the Democrats. And then you can accidentally create an environment where people, their takeaway is like, I guess maybe the Republicans are a little better. And that is not the impression I want to leave with people because it's not true.
Right.
And so I had to reevaluate and go, I got to get my priorities better. And I got to be more honest with what my politics actually are in terms of what I'm talking about and what I'm covering and how I'm covering it. You know what I mean? And it's an important thing that I think is overlooked by a lot of content creators, where they don't realize you can have your nominal politics, but what are your effective politics? What are you creating more in the world of?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's a great point.
So anyway, all right, that was fun. Everybody go check out their show, Adam and Sitch show, or Sitch and Adam show. They hate it when you flip it.
Really?
Adam loves it, Sitch hates it because he wants to be the first one. So anyway, thanks for watching Kyle, Crystal, and Friends. We really appreciate it. Everybody do us a big favor. If you like what you saw here, you can sign up on Substack. The link is always in the video description box below. If you pay $5 a month, you get the video of every single interview/debate, and you get it a day early. Everybody else, if they sign up for free on Substack, they can get the audio version of the podcast, and they get it a day later. And remember, we don't talk to any advertisers or anything for this show, so it's fully dependent upon you wonderful people to help us out. And that's all we got. We love you. We'll talk to you later. Peace. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.